Good evening. Welcome once again to Shelter in Place Storytime with your host, me, Paul Klemperer. What week is this? Aha! When did we start? It seems like we've been doing this sort of thing forever. Do you remember what our lives were like back in olden days when we just did whatever we felt like? Well, I think it was middle of March that this all started. And actually, I do remember it well. I started the first week, March 11th. Tom, welcome back. I'll give shout outs before I start reading. I think it was March 11th was my last, or 12th was my last public gig, on a stage with money and things like that. Way back in that olden times. And then I decided to try my hand at these live streamings, and I did a few different ones and settled on Shelter in Place Storytime on Sundays. And welcome. Tracy, Jenny, welcome for joining me. Joseph, pull up a yoga ball or whatever, one of those kneeling tables that they are productive at or something. I prefer a nice comfy chair. Put him in the comfy chair. Or, yoga mat or whatever makes you happy. Get a cocktail or a beverage. I'm having a soothing, sort of a homemade latte decaf. I shouldn't even tell you what's in here, but it's soothing. Yes, anyway, I'm just kind of trying to reconstruct how we all got here. And this live streaming thing, it's for better or worse, it's a way to stay in touch, and I do appreciate people joining me. You're never obligated. You're never obligated when you came to my real gigs. Come on in the club or don't. And, I'm never going to say, oh, please support live music, because it doesn't, you can't beg. It just doesn't look good. It doesn't look good to beg. But, I do appreciate any support and just the general idea that our community, we support each other. So that's one thing that I felt from the beginning of this period. Barbara, Trudy, Javier, bienvenidos, and all that. So anyway, continue to support each other in whatever way that means, whether it's just not saying something snarky on Facebook. It's like, oh, before you press send, or, whatever. Maybe you have to unleash the snark because we need to, strip away these layers of, whatever it is that's keeping us from being real. I don't know. But I figured a story at the end of the week, or the beginning of the week, depending on how you define Sunday, is helpful. So it helps me to read, and I'm glad you're here. And I've got a random selection tonight. I've found this little book that a good friend left with me. It's called Lives of the Musicians, and it's sort of for children, and it's little biographies of classical musicians, and it's very interesting because it's written in this sort of and he was born in a barn, and he composed his first symphony when he was 8, and then he died of syphilis when he was 40. So it's kind of a weird way to present the 19th century and earlier to the wee folk, but it's good to let them know about. There were other things before Corona and COVID-19. There was syphilis and other classical musician diseases. Anyway, but these folks I'm going to read about, I don't believe they died of syphilis, so set your mind at ease. We're going to start with a little bio of Giuseppe Verdi, born in La Roncole, Italy, 1813, died in Milano, Italy, 1901. Are you ready? Are you relaxed? Indrajit, Christina, thanks for joining me. Here we go. On the day in 1814, when the army invaded the tiny Italian village of Le Roncole, Luigia Verdi ran up into the bell tower of the town's church. The soldiers killed everyone in the church except her and the baby she had grabbed on her way. They hid in the tower until the army was gone and it was safe to come down. His mother had saved Giuseppe Verdi's life and part of the history of opera. As an altar boy at the same church a few years later, Verdi was so entranced when he first heard an organ play that he didn't hear the priest telling him what to do. The priest lost his temper and pushed the boy down the stairs. Verdi, when he came to, begged his parents for music lessons. He was the village organist by age 10, and in his teens walked 6 miles, rain or shine, between 2 towns for his organist jobs. One stormy Christmas Eve, he fell into a flooded drainage ditch and had to be rescued. Verdi married his childhood sweetheart, Margherita. He wrote his second opera during a tragic period when his wife and his 2 children fell ill and died. See what I mean? It's sort of a children's book, but the weirdest facts for kids. Let this be a lesson to you, children. Life is hard. Life is hard. All right, more about Verdi. It was supposed to be a comic opera, but perhaps Verdi was too sad to make it lighthearted. For when it was produced, the audience hissed their disapproval. Verdi was disappointed and swore off composing. Then the manager of La Scala Opera House in Milan begged him to write music for a new libretto. Verdi wasn't going to read it, but his eye happened to fall on a page, and he was up all night. By morning, he had the words memorized. The result was his third opera, Nabucco, and this time the roar of approval was so loud that Verdi was frightened. He thought the audience was booing. With later operas, such as Aida and La Traviata, the rehearsal halls had to be sealed against thousands wanting early peeks. Hey, David, Shirley. Welcome. Reading about Verdi. Verdi cared little what critics thought about his music, but he did want to please the public. The public will stand for anything except boredom. The public was far from bored, and with his riches, Verdi bought a farm in the country. Verdi was probably the only important composer who was also a successful farmer. Using the latest techniques, he grew vegetables, raised livestock, and planted a tree every time he finished another opera. He and his second wife, a famous soprano named Giuseppina, had no children. He loved animals and had cats, parrots, peacocks, and a spaniel named Lulu. He often wore a flower in his buttonhole, and the only presents he liked were plants, especially cacti or palms. Verdi liked the simple life. He awoke at 5, walked around his estate, perhaps going for a sail across his lake in a small boat. He liked to read poetry, especially Shakespeare, and history, and he went to bed early, like a good composer. Verdi might also be the only composer who was also a senator. With reluctance, he kept his appointment to the Italian legislature, where his main concern was to put free musical education in the schools. Verdi would not have liked this book. He wanted his music to speak for him, and he thought his life was nobody's business. Once he hid out in a tool shed when a group of fans came to visit. A much-loved figure in Italy, Verdi lived to be 87. His funeral was huge, and everyone sang songs from, of course, operas by Verdi. So that was about Giuseppe Verdi. Is the sound okay? I'm just sort of dialing this in here. I'll make sure that it's loud enough. Okay. And I've got music by my good friend Joel Dilly on the CD player, just a little background music, in case you're wondering. All right, one more about our classical music progenitors. For us in the music community, we like to have inspiration from all areas. And this next composer did influence me just because his music's so cool. I remember when I was little, I put on the Rite of Spring, and realized I was alone in the house, and I started to get really scared because all that pagan dun 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 in odd meters, those odd meters will get you. And I got scared and had to take it off. But later, I listened to it. And, you know, we have nothing to fear but fear itself and bad music. All right, here we go. Igor Stravinsky, born in Oranienbaum, Russia, 1882, died in New York City, 1971. The most famous riot in classical music history took place on May 29, 1913, at the Paris premiere of The Rite of Spring. Half the people stood up and cheered. The other half screamed till their faces turned purple. Police arrived to break up fights. Hardly a note of the music could even be heard. Igor Stravinsky, who had written the music, left the theater and took a taxi to a park. "I have never been that angry," he said. The most wonderful event of the year to Stravinsky was when he was a child was the coming of spring. The violent Russian spring that seemed to begin in an hour and was like the whole earth cracking. "Otherwise," said Stravinsky, "I do not like to remember my childhood." His father, an opera singer, had an uncontrollable temper, and Stravinsky was frightened of him. We've all been there. Nor was he close to his mother, even after he was famous. She could scold him until he almost cried for not writing music like the composers she liked, or his piano teacher, a blockhead. Stravinsky saw Tchaikovsky's The Sleeping Beauty at age 8, started piano lessons, and was soon spending 6 nights a week at the theater. Later, his parents insisted that he go to law school, but encouragement from his music teacher gave Stravinsky the idea of leaving law for music. Stravinsky was one of very few composers who reached success overnight, in his case with The Firebird, a ballet based on old Russian legends. And after The Rite of Spring, which some say changed the whole course of music, he was world famous for the rest of his life. He developed self-confidence and a large ego. To amuse himself, he kept a file of pictures of conductors in ridiculous poses. Stravinsky supported himself through composing. When asked about the high fees he charged, he explained, "I do it on behalf of my brother composers Schubert and Mozart, who died in poverty." Always in search of the quiet he needed to compose, Stravinsky left Russia for Switzerland, then Paris, and finally California, where he lived in Hollywood. He married his cousin and childhood sweetheart, Catherine Nosenko. One of their 4 children, Solima, was a pianist who later toured with his father. After Catherine died, Stravinsky married Vera Sudaikin, a painter. "My music is best understood by children and animals," Stravinsky claimed. When in a new city, he always visited the zoo first. He smoked cigarettes in a long holder made of an albatross beak. His house was full of birds. His work habits were compulsively neat. His writing desk had carefully arranged erasers, bottles of 5 different colored inks, glittering steel rulers, writing instruments, some of his own invention, and a pile of dictionaries. He knew 4 languages. When lunch, perhaps rare roast beef, dark bread, and Italian espresso, was ready, Mrs. Stravinsky would clap her hands in the hall beneath his studio. If he was ready, he would clap his hands too. He relaxed by playing card games, going to movies, standing on his head, he said it cleared his brain, and sunbathing nude. We can all relate to that, I'm sure. He wore a battered green beret even to bed, and had a vast collection of silk scarves. Superstitious, he wore sacred medals pinned to his underwear. Stravinsky had many illnesses, including tuberculosis, but he must have been stronger than he seemed, because he lived until he was 89. He is buried in the Russian corner of an Italian cemetery. Igor Stravinsky. Well, anyway, I hope that was inspiring to all of us out there, trying to be creative in whatever way we can manage. This is a time for bringing the best of our creative energies out, because, you know, if we can't, no, I don't stand on my head, Sheila says. Well, okay. You don't have to. You can just do like the, what do they call it, the corpse position in yoga? Just, whatever gets you centered. All right, I've got one more little ditty before we delve into a couple of short stories. I thought this might be fun. I found a book of soliloquies, Shakespearean monologues, and, not to get too heavy. Oh, the title of the books I've been asked. I'll even hold this one up. It'll be backwards. This is Lives of the Musicians, is what I read from. in big print for children. It spares no gory details of classical music. Now this one is a little monologue from Shakespeare, and I picked it because even though the language is Shakespearean, so maybe a little obscure, I think you can get the gist of it. And it's really a little soliloquy about the fall from power, and what we might say in contemporary terms, being thrown under the bus, as it were. So I hope you enjoy this. From Henry VIII, Cardinal Wolsey, Act 3, Scene 2, London, the palace of Henry VIII. Cardinal Wolsey has opposed the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn. It has also been discovered that Wolsey has amassed a large fortune. In retaliation, the king orders him stripped of state power and his possessions. Norfolk to Wolsey. And so we'll leave you to your meditations how to live better. For your stubborn answer about the giving back the Great Seal to us, the king shall know it, and, no doubt, shall thank you. So fare you well, my little good Lord Cardinal. Cardinal Wolsey. So farewell, to the little good you bear me. Farewell, a long farewell to all my greatness. This is the state of man. Today he puts forth the tender leaves of hopes. Tomorrow blossoms, and bears his blushing honors thick upon him. The third day comes a frost, a killing frost. And when he thinks, good easy man, full surely his greatness is a ripening, nips his root, and then he falls as I do. I have ventured, like little wanton boys that swim on bladders, this many summers in a sea of glory. But far beyond my depth, my high-blown pride at length broke under me, and now has left me weary and old with service, to the mercy of a rude stream that must forever hide me. Vain pomp and glory of this world, I hate ye. I feel my heart new opened. Oh, how wretched is that poor man that hangs on princes' favours! There is betwixt that smile we would aspire to, that sweet aspect of princes and their ruin, more pangs and fears than wars or women have, and when he falls like Lucifer, never to hope again. Food for thought. All right. How's everybody doing? Welcome, Carmen, Deanna, Scott. I'm going to delve now into a different sort of classic. I found in my extensive library here at the mansion a little ditty, a little book of Damon Runyon. I know it's backwards, but if you're not familiar with Damon Runyon, you should be. Writer, most of his stories set in New York. Basically, his stories were the basis for the musical Guys and Dolls. So that gives you an idea. And I'm not going to give too much of an introduction. You're on your own, but just imagine you're in 1930s New York, a Frank Capra sort of a thing, where people talk like this, and yeah, Edward G. kind of thing. So you're on your own, but I hope you enjoy it. This is called Breach of Promise. One day, a certain party by the name of Judge Goldfather, who is a lawyer by trade, sends word to me that he wishes me to call on him at his office in Lower Broadway, and while ordinarily I do not care for any part of lawyers, it happens that Judge Goldfather is a friend of mine, so I go to see him. Of course, Judge Goldfarber is not a judge, and never is a judge, and he is 100 to 1 in my line against ever being a judge, but he is called Judge because it pleases him, and everybody always wishes to please Judge Goldfarber, as he is one of the surest-footed lawyers in this town and beats more tough beefs for different citizens than seems possible. He is a wonderful hand for keeping citizens from getting into the sneezer, and better than Houdini when it comes to getting them out of the sneezer after they are in. Personally, I never have any use for the professional services of Judge Goldfarber, as I am a law-abiding citizen at all times, and am greatly opposed to guys who violate the law, but I know the judge from around and about for many years. I know him around about the nightclubs and other deadfalls, for Judge Goldfarber is such a guy as loves to mingle with the public in these spots, as he picks up much law business there, and sometimes a nice doll. Well, when I call on Judge Goldfarber, he takes me into his private office and wishes to know if I can think of a couple of deserving guys who are out of employment and who will like a job of work, and if so, Judge Goldfarber says he can offer them a first-class position. Of course, Judge Goldfarber says, it is not steady employment, and in fact it is nothing but piecework, but the parties must be extremely reliable parties who can be depended on in a pinch. This is out-of-town work that requires tact and, he says, some nerve. Well, I'm about to tell Judge Goldfarber that I am no employment agent and go on about my business, because I can tell from the way he says the parties must be parties who can be depended on in a pinch, that a pinch is apt to come up on the job any minute, and I do not care to steer my friends of mine against a pinch. But as I get up to go, I look out of Judge Goldfarber's window, and I can see Brooklyn in the distance beyond the river, and seeing Brooklyn, I get to thinking of certain parties over there that I figure must be suffering terribly from the unemployment situation. I get to thinking of Harry the Horse, and Spanish John, and Little Isidore. And the reason I figure they must be suffering from the unemployment situation is because if nobody is working and making any money, there is nobody for them to rob. And if there is nobody for them to rob, Harry the Horse and Spanish John and Little Isidore are just naturally bound to be feeling the depression keenly. Anyway, I finally mention the names of these parties to Judge Goldfarber, and furthermore, I speak well of their reliability in a pinch and of their nerve, although I cannot conscientiously recommend their tact, and Judge Goldfarber is greatly delighted, as he often hears of Harry the Horse and Spanish John and Little Isidore. Just going to take a moment of shout-outs to Steve, Tom, Haley. Welcome, welcome. Reading a little Damon Runyon. If you just joined me, nothing major's happened yet. But we might want to have a sip of your favorite beverage. I hope everybody is relaxing as the sun goes down. I see out of my mansion window. It's a beautiful evening. And so we go. He asks me for their addresses, but of course nobody knows exactly where Harry the Horse and Spanish John and Little Isidore live, because they do not live anywhere in particular. However, I tell him about a certain spot in Clinton Street where he may be able to get track of them, and then I leave Judge Goldfarber for fear he may wish me to take word to these parties, and if there's anybody in this world who I will not care to take word to, or to have any truck with in any manner, shape, or form, it is Harry the Horse and Spanish John and Little Isidore. Well, I do not hear anything more of the matter for several weeks, but one evening when I am in Mindy's restaurant on Broadway enjoying a little cold borscht, which is a most refreshing matter in hot weather such as is going on at the time, who bobs up but Harry the Horse and Spanish John and Little Isidore, and I am so surprised to see them that some of my cold borscht goes down the wrong way, and I almost choke to death. However, they seem quite friendly, and in fact, Harry the Horse pounds me on the back to keep me from choking, and while he pounds so hard that he almost caves in my spine, I consider it a most courteous action, and when I am able to talk again, I say to him as follows: "Well, Harry," I say, "it is a privilege and a pleasure to see you again, and I hope and trust you will all join me in some cold borscht, which you will find very nice indeed." "No," Harry says, "we do not care for any cold borscht. We are looking for Judge Goldfarber. Do you see Judge Goldfarber round and about lately?" Well, the idea of Harry the Horse and Spanish John and little Isidore looking for Judge Goldfarber sounds something alarming to me, and I figure maybe the job Judge Goldfarber gives them turns out bad, and they wish to take Judge Goldfarber apart. But the next minute Harry says to me like this: "By the way," he says, "we wish to thank you for the job of work you throw our way. Maybe someday we will be able to do as much for you. It is a most interesting job," Harry says, "and while you are snuffing your cold borscht, I will give you the details so you will understand why we wish to see Judge Goldfarber." It turns out Harry the Horse says that the job is not for Judge Goldfarber personally, but for a client of his. And who is this client but Mr. Jabez Tuesday, the rich millionaire who owns the Tuesday string of one-arm joints where many citizens go for food and wait on themselves. Judge Goldfarber comes to see us in Brooklyn in person and sends me to see Mr. Jabez Tuesday with a letter of introduction, so Mr. Jabez Tuesday can explain what he wishes me to do, because Judge Goldfarber is too smart a guy to be explaining such matters to me himself. In fact, for all I know, maybe Judge Goldfarber is not aware of what Mr. Jabez Tuesday wishes me to do, although I am willing to lay a little 6 to 5 that Judge Goldfarber does not think Mr. Jabez Tuesday wishes to hire me as a cashier in any of his one-arm joints. Anyway, I go to see Mr. Tuesday at a Fifth Avenue hotel where he makes his home, and where he has a very swell layout of rooms, and I am by no means impressed with Mr. Tuesday, as he hams and haws quite a bit before he tells me the nature of the employment he has in mind for me. He is a little guy, somewhat dried out, with a bald head and a small mouser on his upper lip. I'm just going to pause to Rebecca, Lauren, Carolyn, welcome. Thank you for joining me for Shelter-in-Place Storytime. And I just want to say to those who are perhaps less than 40 years of age, a little mouser on his upper lip means a little mustache, just so you know. A little mouser on his upper lip, and he wears specs and seems somewhat nervous. Well, it takes him some time to get down to cases and tell me what is eating him and what he wishes to do. And then it all sounds very simple indeed, and in fact it sounds so simple that I think Mr. Jabez Tuesday is a little daffy when he tells me he will give me 10 G's for the job. What Mr. Tuesday wishes me to do is to get some letters that he personally writes to a doll by the name of Miss Amelia Bodkin, who lives in a house just outside Tarrytown, because it seems that Mr. Tuesday makes certain cracks in these letters that he is now sorry for, such as speaking of love and marriage and one thing and another to Miss Amelia Bodkin, and he is afraid she is going to sue him for breach of promise. Such an idea will be very embarrassing to me, Mr. Jabez Tuesday says, as I am about to marry a party who is a member of one of the most high-toned families in this country. It is true, Mr. Tuesday says, that the Scarwater family does not have as much money now as formerly, but there is no doubt about it being very, very high-toned, and my fiancée, Miss Valerie Scarwater, is one of the highest-toned of them all. In fact, he says, she is so high-toned that the chances are she will be very huffy about anybody suing me for breach of promise and cancel everything. Sorry, I have to take a sip. I am not a professional narrator, but I like to do it in my own home. Welcome, Julie. Okay. Our plot so far, these salt-of-the-earth types were hired to get these letters, these billets doux, one might say, back from a doll in New York, see? Okay. Well, I ask Mr. Tuesday what a breach of promise is, and he explains to me that it is when somebody promises to do something and fails to do this something, although, of course, we have a different name for a proposition of this nature in Brooklyn and deal with it accordingly. This is a very easy job for a person of your standing, Mr. Tuesday says. Miss Amelia Bodkin lives all alone in her house the other side of Tarrytown, except for a couple of servants, and they are old and harmless. Now the idea is, he says, you are not to go to her house as if you are looking for the letters, but as if you are after something else, such as her silverware, which is quite antique and very valuable. She keeps the letters in a big inlaid box in her room, Mr. Tuesday says. And if you just pick up this box and carry it away along with the silverware, no one will ever suspect that you are after the letters, but that you take the box thinking it contains valuables. You bring the letters to me and get your 10 G's, Mr. Tuesday says. And, he says, you can keep the silverware too. Be sure you get a Paul Revere teapot with the silverware, he says. It is worth plenty. Well, I say to Mr. Tuesday, every guy knows his own business best, and I do not wish to knock myself out of a nice soft job, but, I say, it seems to me the simplest way of carrying on this transaction is to buy the letters off this doll and be done with it. Personally, I say, I do not believe there is a doll in the world who is not willing to sell a whole post office full of letters for 10 G's, especially in these times, and throw in a set of Shakespeare with them. No, no, Mr. Tuesday says. Such a course will not do with Miss Amelia Bodkin at all. You see, he says, Miss Bodkin and I are very, very friendly for a matter of maybe 15 or 16 years. In fact, we are very friendly indeed. She does not have any idea at this time that I wish to break off this friendship with her. Now, he says, if I try to buy the letters from her, she may become suspicious. The idea, Mr. Tuesday says, is for me to get the letters first and then explain to her about breaking off the friendship and make suitable arrangements with her afterwards. Do not get Miss Amelia Bodkin... Oh, sorry, wrong voice. Do not get Miss Amelia Bodkin wrong, Mr. Tuesday says. She is an excellent person, but, he says, you know the saying, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And maybe Miss Amelia Bodkin may figure I am scorning her if she finds out I'm going to marry Miss Valerie Scarwater, and furthermore, he says, if she still has the letters, she may fall into the hands of unscrupulous lawyers and demand a very large sum indeed. But, Mr. Tuesday says, this does not worry me half as much as the idea that Miss Valerie Scarwater may learn about the letters and get a wrong impression of my friendship with Miss Amelia Bodkin. Well, I round up Spanish John and little Isidore the next afternoon, and I find little Isidore playing clob with a guy by the name of Educated Edmund, who is called Educated Edmund because he once goes to Erasmus High School and is considered a very fine scholar indeed, so I invite Educated Edmund to go along with us. The idea is, I know Educated Edmund makes a fair living playing clob with little Isidore, and I figure as long as I am depriving Educated Edmund of a living for a while, it is only courteous to toss something else his way. Furthermore, I figure as long as letters are involved in this proposition, it may be a good thing to have Educated Edmund handy in case any reading becomes necessary, because Spanish John and little Isidore do not read at all, and I read only large print. We borrow a car off a friend of mine in Clinton Street, and with me driving we start for Tarrytown, which is a spot up the Hudson River, and it is a very enjoyable ride for one and all on account of the scenery. It is the first time Educated Edmund and Spanish John and little Isidore ever see the scenery along the Hudson, although they all reside on the banks of this beautiful river for several years as at Ossining. Just another, kind of like the mouse around the lip. Ossining is where they keep the state prison, I believe. Just, above Manhattan. How's everybody doing? Julie, bonsoir, Ben, James, good to see you. Personally, I am never in Ossining, although once I make Auburn and once Comstock, but the scenery in these localities is nothing to speak of. We hit Tarrytown about dark and follow the main drag through this burg, as Mr. Tuesday tells me, until finally we come to the spot I'm looking for, which is a little white cottage on a slope of ground above the river, not far off the highway. This little white cottage has quite a piece of ground around it, and a low stone wall with a driveway from the highway to the house, and when I spot the gate to the driveway, I make a quick turn, and what happens but I run the car slap dab into a stone gate post, and the car folds up like an accordion. You see, the idea is we are figuring to make this a fast, stick-up job without any foolishness about it, maybe leaving any parties we come across tied up good and tight while we make a getaway, as I am greatly opposed to housebreaking or sneak jobs, as I do not consider them dignified. Furthermore, they take too much time, so I am going to run the car right up to the front door when this stone post gets in my way. The next thing I know, I open my eyes to find myself in a strange bed, and also in a strange bedroom. And while I wake up in many a strange bed in my time, I never wake up in such a strange bedroom as this. It is all very soft and dainty, and the only jarring note in my surroundings is Spanish John sitting beside the bed looking at me. Naturally, I wish to know what it's what, and Spanish John says I am knocked snoring in the collision with the gatepost, although none of the others are hurt, and that while I am stretched in the driveway with the blood running out of a bad gash in my noggin, who pops out of the house but a doll and an old guy who seems to be a butler or some such, and the doll insists on them lugging me into the house and placing me in this bedroom. Then she washes the blood off me, Spanish John says, and wraps my head up and personally goes to Tarrytown to get a croaker to see if my wounds are fatal or what, while educated Edmund and little Isidore are trying to patch up the car. So, Spanish John says, he is sitting there to watch me until she comes back, although of course I know what he is really sitting there for is to get first search at me in case I do not recover. Well, while I am thinking all this over and wondering what is to be done, in pops a doll of maybe 40-odd who is built from the ground up, but who has a nice, kind-looking pan with a large smile, and behind her is a guy I can see at once is a croaker, especially as he is packing a little black bag and has a gray goatee. Just to interrupt myself, you probably gathered from the context, croaker is a colloquialism for doctor. Let's have a drink. All right, the croaker has entered the room. I never see a nicer looking doll if you care for middling old dolls, although personally I like them young, and when she sees me with my eyes open, she speaks as follows. "Oh," she says, "I am glad you are not dead, you poor chap. But," she says, "here is Dr. Diffingwell, and he will see how badly you are injured. My name is Miss Amelia Bodkin, and this is my house, and this is my own bedroom, and I am very, very sorry you are hurt." Well, naturally, I consider this a most embarrassing situation, because here I am out to clip Miss Amelia Bodkin of her letters and her silverware, including her Paul Revere teapot, and there she is taking care of me in first-class style, and saying she is sorry for me. But there seems to be nothing for me to say at this time, so I hold still while the croaker looks me over, and after he peeks at my noggin and gives me a good feel up and down, he states as follows. "This is very bad cut," he says. "I will have to stitch it up, and then he must be very, very quiet for a few days, otherwise," he says, "complications may set in. It is best to move him to a hospital at once." But Miss Amelia Bodkin will not listen to such an idea as moving me to a hospital. Miss Amelia Bodkin says I must rest right where I am, and she will take care of me, because she says I am injured on her premises by her gatepost, and it is only fair that she does something for me. In fact, from the way Miss Amelia Bodkin takes on about me being moved, I figure maybe it is the old sex appeal, although afterwards I find out it is only because she is lonesome, and nursing me will give her something to do. Well, naturally, I am not opposing her idea, because the way I look at it, I will be able to handle the situation about the letters and also the silverware very nicely as an inside job, so I try to act even worse off than I am. Although, of course, anybody who knows about the time I carry 8 slugs in my body from Broadway and 50th Street to Brooklyn will laugh very heartily at the idea of a cut on the noggin keeping me in bed. After the croaker gets through sewing me up and goes away, I tell Spanish John to take educated Edmund and little Isidore and go on back to New York, but to keep in touch with me by telephone so I can tell them when to come back. And then I go to sleep because I seem to be very tired. When I wake up later in the night, I seem to have a fever and am really somewhat sick, and Miss Amelia Bodkin is sitting beside my bed, swabbing my noggin with a cool cloth, which feels very pleasant indeed. I am better in the morning and able to knock over a little breakfast which she brings to me on a tray, and I am commencing to see where being an invalid is not so bad at that, especially when there are no coppers at your bedside every time you open your eyes asking who does it to you. I can see Miss Amelia Bodkin gets quite a bang out of having somebody to take care of, although, of course, if she knows who she is taking care of at this time, the chances are she will be running up the road calling for the gendarmes. It is not until after breakfast that I get her to go and grab herself a little sleep while she is away sleeping. The old guy, who seems to be the butler, is in and out of my room every now and then to see how I am getting along. How's everybody doing? Hello, Justin, David, Justice. Oh, David, Reuben, Allison, very good to see you. Sorry, I'm talking myself hoarse. We're doing a little Damon Runyon here. Hope everybody's comfortable. Week 6, 7 of this sheltering in place. I don't even remember. But we're going along. He is a gabby old guy, and pretty soon he is telling me all about Miss Amelia Bodkin, and what he tells me is that she is the old-time sweetheart of a guy in New York who is at the head of a big business and very rich. And of course I know this guy is Mr. Jabez Tuesday, although the old guy, who seems to be the butler, never mentions his name. They are together many years, he says to me. He is very poor when they meet, and she has a little money, and establishes him in business. And by her management of this business and of him, she makes it a very large business indeed, I know, because I am with them almost from the start, the old guy says. She is very smart in business, and also very kind and nice if anybody asks you. Now, the old guy says, I am never able to figure out why they do not get married, because there is no doubt she loves him and he loves her. But Miss Amelia Bodkin once tells me that it is because they are too poor at the start and too busy later on to think of such things as getting married. And so they drift along the way they are until all of a sudden he is rich. Then, the old guy says, I can see he is getting away from her, although she never sees it herself. And I am not surprised when a few years ago he convinces her it is best for her to retire from active work and move out to this spot. He comes out here fairly often at first, the old guy says, but gradually he stretches the time between his visits, and now we do not see him once in a coon's age. Well, the old guy says, it is just such a case as often comes up in life. In fact, I personally know of some others, but Miss Amelia Bodkin still thinks he loves her, and that only business keeps him away so much. So you can see she either is not as smart as she looks, or is kidding herself. Well, the old guy says, I will now bring you a little orange juice, although I do not mind saying you do not look to me like a guy who drinks orange juice as a steady proposition. Oh, I see. I'm getting a comment. People want to know what I'm reading. This is Damon Runyon, and you might, if you don't know who Damon Runyon is, you might want to Google it. But just you get the gist of it. Just imagine yourself 1930s New York. All right. Now I am taking many a gander around the bedroom to see if I can case the box of letters that Mr. Jabez Tuesday speaks of, but there is no box, such as he describes, in sight. Then, in the evening, when Miss Amelia Bodkin is in the room, and I seem to be dozing, she pulls out a drawer in the bureau and hauls out a big inlaid box and sits down at a table under a reading lamp and opens the box and begins reading some old letters. And as she sits there reading those letters, with me watching her through my eyelashes, sometimes she smiles, but once I see little tears rolling down her cheeks. All of a sudden she looks at me and catches me with my eyes wide open, and I can see her face turn red, and then she laughs and speaks to me as follows. "Old love letters," she says, tapping the box. "From my old sweetheart," she says. "I read some of them every night of my life. Am I not foolish and sentimental to do such a thing?" Well, I tell Miss Amelia Bodkin she is sentimental all right, but I do not tell her just how foolish she is to be letting me in on where she plants these letters, although of course I am greatly pleased to have this information. I tell Miss Amelia Bodkin that personally I never write a love letter and never get a love letter, and in fact, while I hear of these propositions, I never even see a love letter before. And this is all as true as you are a foot high. Then Miss Amelia Bodkin laughs a little and says to me as follows. "Why," she says, "you are a very unusual chap indeed, not to know what a love letter is like. Why," she says, "I think I will read you a few of the most wonderful love letters in this world. It will do no harm," she says, "because you do not know the writer, and you must lie there and think of me, not old and ugly as you see me now, but as young and maybe a little bit pretty." So Miss Amelia Bodkin opens a letter and reads it to me, and her voice is soft and low as she reads, but she scarcely ever looks at the letter as she is reading, so I can see she knows it pretty much by heart. Furthermore, I can see that she thinks this letter is quite a masterpiece, but while I am no judge of love letters, because this is the first one I ever hear, I wish to say I consider it nothing but great nonsense. "Sweetheart mine," this love letter says, "I am still thinking of you as I see you yesterday standing in front of the house with the sunlight turning your dark brown hair to wonderful bronze. Darling," it says, "I love the color of your hair. I am so glad you are not a blonde. I hate blondes. They are so empty-headed and mean and deceitful. Also, they are bad-tempered," the letter says. "I will never trust a blonde any further than I can throw a bull by the tail. I never see a blonde in my life who is not a plum washout," it says. "Most of them are nothing but peroxide anyway. Business is improving," it says. "Sausage is going up. I love you now and always, my baby doll." Well, there are others worse than this, and all of them speak of her as sweetheart, or baby, or darlingest one, and also as lovey-kins, and precious, and angel, and I do not know what all else, and several of them speak of how things will be after they marry. And as I judge these are Mr. Jabez Tuesday's letters all right, I can see where they are full of dynamite for a guy who is figuring on taking a run-out powder on a doll. In fact, I say something to this general effect to Miss Amelia Bodkin, just for something to say. "Why," she says, "what do you mean?" "Well," I says, "documents such as these are known to bring large prices under certain conditions." Now Miss Amelia Bodkin looks at me a moment as if wondering what is in my mind, and then she shakes her head as if she gives it up, and laughs and speaks as follows. "Well," she says, "one thing is certain, my letters will never bring a price, no matter how large, under any conditions, even if anybody ever wants them. Why," she says, "these are my greatest treasure. They are my memories of my happiest days. Why, she says, I will not part with these letters for $1,000,000. Naturally, I can see from this remark that Mr. Jabez Tuesday makes a very economical deal with me at 10 G's for the letters. But of course I do not mention this to Miss Amelia Bodkin, as I watch her put her love letters back in the inlaid box and put the box back in the drawer of the bureau. I thank her for letting me hear the letters, and then I tell her good night, and I go to sleep. And the next day I telephone to a certain number in Clinton Street and leave word for Educated Edmund and Spanish John and little Isidore to come and get me, as I am tired of being an invalid. Now the next day is Saturday, and the day that comes after is bound to be Sunday, and they come to see me on Saturday and promise to come back for me Sunday, as the car is now unraveled and running all right, although my friend in Clinton Street is beefing no little about the way his fenders are bent. But before they arrive Sunday morning, who is there ahead of them bright and early but Mr. Jabez Tuesday in a big town car? Gotta take a sip. Greetings, greetings, everyone. Hank. Domo, no, what's it? Konnichiwa. And Alonzo, good to see you. All right. Reading Damon Runyon. This is backwards, but it's a great little, what they used to call pulp novel. Furthermore, as he walks into the house, all dressed up in a cutaway coat and a high hat, he grabs Miss Amelia Bodkin in his arms and kisses her kerplump right on the smush, which information I afterwards receive from the old guy who seems to be the butler. From upstairs I can personally hear Miss Amelia Bodkin crying more than somewhat, and then I hear Mr. Jabez Tuesday speak in a loud, hearty voice as follows. Now, Melly, Mr. Tuesday says, do not be crying, especially on my new white vest. Cheer up, Mr. Tuesday says, and listen to the arrangements I make for our wedding tomorrow and our honeymoon in Montreal. Yes, indeed, Melly, Mr. Tuesday says, you are the only one for me, because you understand me from A to Izzard. Give me another big kiss, Melly, and let us sit down and talk things over. Well, I judge from the sound that he gets his kiss, and it is a very large kiss indeed, with the cutout open, and then I hear them chewing the rag at great length in the living room downstairs. Finally, I hear Mr. Jabez Tuesday speak as follows. You know, Melly, he says, you and I are just plain ordinary folks without any lugs, and, he says, this is why we fit each other so well. I am sick and tired of people who pretend to be high-toned and mighty when they do not have a white quarter to their name. They have no manners whatsoever. Why, only last night, Mr. Jabez Tuesday says, I am calling on a high-toned family in New York by the name of Scarwater, and out of a clear sky, I am grossly insulted by the daughter of the house and practically turned out in the street. I never received such treatment in my life, he says. Melly, he says, give me another kiss and see if you feel a bump here on my head. Of course, Mr. Jabez Tuesday is somewhat surprised to see me present later on, but he never lets on he knows me, and naturally I do not give Mr. Jabez any tumble whatever at the moment, and by, Educated Edmund and Spanish John and little Isidore come for me in the car, and I thank Miss Amelia Bodkin for her kindness to me, and leave her standing on the lawn with Mr. Jabez Tuesday waving us goodbye. And Miss Amelia Bodkin looks so happy as she snuggles up close to Mr. Jabez Tuesday that I am glad I take the chance, which is always better than an even money chance these days, that Miss Valerie Scarwater is a blonde, and send Educated Edmund to her to read her Mr. Tuesday's letter in which he speaks of blondes. But of course I am sorry that this and other letters that I tell Educated Edmund to read to her heats her up so far as to make her forget she is a lady, and causes her to slug Mr. Jabez Tuesday on the bean with an 18-karat vanity case, as she tells him to get out of her life. So, Harry the horse says, "There is nothing more to the story, except we are now looking for Judge Goldfaber to get him to take up a legal matter for us with Mr. Jabez Tuesday. It is true, Mr. Tuesday pays us the 10 G's, but he never lets us take the silverware he speaks of, not even the Paul Revere teapot, which he says is so valuable. And in fact, when we drop around to Miss Amelia Bodkin's house to pick up these articles one night not long ago, the old guy, who seems to be the butler, lets off a double-barreled shotgun at us and acts very nasty in general. So," Harry says, "we are going to see if we can get Judge Goldfaber to sue Mr. Jabez Tuesday for breach of promise." The end. I hope you enjoyed that. Any questions? Feel free to text me now. Breach of promise. Oh my, it's 5 till 9. Well, if you're game, I'm game. I'm going to keep going and read. It's a little bit long, but we'll just see what happens. And if you can't handle it and need to go to bed, that's the whole purpose of this shelter-in-place story time with me, your host, Paul Klemperer. And stay in touch at pksacks.com, my website. Of course, I'm doing all this on Facebook, and I also have a YouTube channel where I post previous live streams as I get them under control technologically and put the files on my YouTube channel, which I believe is Paul Klemperer. I don't know, but good luck. But I also have more story times from previous Sundays, as well as the Jazz Wednesdays live streaming, and we are featuring the theme Space Force Jazz Lounge for the duration through this Corona period. And we'll be doing that this Wednesday. All right, I'm going to continue on just for the heck of it. I found a book of historical whodunits. And I can't say anything about this except that it's hopefully not too long. And but it features historical figures. So this is called Leonardo Da Vinci, Detective by Theodore Mathewson. And that's all I'm going to say about this. I'm just going to delve right in. On a fine late spring afternoon in 1516, Leonardo da Vinci sat peacefully in the rose-embowered garden behind his mansion near Amboise, with a sketching pad upon his lap, drawing a golden oriole which fluttered occasionally within the confines of a large aviary. Although the Italian master was over 60 now, white-bearded and slightly stooped, the hand that had painted The Last Supper and Mona Lisa had lost none of its deftness, nor his eyes their keen brilliance. All around rose the gentle, sun-warmed hills of central France, and the bees hummed in the chaparral. His young servant, Jacques, stepped hesitantly from the terrace to confront him, then spoke softly. "Maître, a gentleman from Amboise. He demands to see you." Leonardo nodded kindly, but before the boy could turn to deliver the message, a tall, sturdy, black-haired figure with a thick beard strode across the terrace. "Ah, Monsieur Blanchard," Leonardo said sympathetically. "You shatter the sylvan peace with your distress. Sit down and observe the golden oriole with me. I do not care to take the bird into captivity like this, but the oriole is most difficult to sketch in its natural habitat." "You mistake me, monsieur," the man said. "I am not Monsieur Blanchard." "Have my eyes lost their skill?" Leonardo said, blinking up at him. "Indeed they must have, for you are not the king's minister after all." "I am Baron de Marigny at your service. The queen is most anxious that you come to Amboise at once." "The queen?" Leonardo looked surprised. His Majesty Francis I of the House of Valois favored him. He had invited Leonardo to live in France and given him this house, opened the castle at Amboise to him, and often sought his company. But the queen, the regal French beauty, had never liked him, and had not dissembled from the first. "How can my humble services be of value to the queen?" Leonardo asked, temporizing. "She gave me explicit orders to discuss nothing, At the same time, Marigny's eyes shifted uneasily to the flutterings of the oriole. His Majesty was not in favor of her calling you at all. But he permitted her to do so? Yes, the Queen's whims are not easily discouraged. Then I shall come at once, Leonardo said, moving toward the terrace, ever to investigate, to know, especially when it is a Queen's whim. Jacques, my cloak. The coach carrying Leonardo and the Baron jolted along the narrow, poplar-lined road to within 100 meters of the gray, rounded contours of the castle, and then debouched into a green open field to the west toward gently rising hills, perhaps a kilometer distant. We approach the amphitheater? Leonardo asked. That is where it happened, Marigny said absently. Then his lips thinned and tightened. They are waiting for you there. They will explain everything. The coach drew up in a cloud of dust at the entrance of the amphitheater, which lay to the south. Here Francis, passionately fond of tournaments, masquerades, and amusements of all kinds, provided outdoor entertainment for himself, his court, and his guests. Colored flags fluttered from tall masts, announcing the afternoon's gala entertainment, already concluded, and nearly everyone had now departed except a small group sitting beneath a striped canopy inside a circle of soldiers. Leonardo recognized the king and queen and their retinue. The minister Blanchard approached Leonardo, his arms outstretched, his pale face smudged with perspiration and dust. This is terrible, Monsieur Da Vinci. Monsieur Laurier has been stabbed in the chest and lies dead within the amphitheater. Her Majesty wishes you investigate this crime and demands to see you at once. Leonardo nodded and strode like a noble patriarch to the others sitting beneath the awning. Arriving before the royal pair, Leonardo bowed deeply. The king, handsome in his large-nosed way, acknowledged the greeting wearily, but his eyes were alert and watchful. Before the queen speaks to you, Leonardo, let me say that I did not wish to disturb you. She is upset and may say things that are personal and uncomplimentary, but I ask you to make allowances. A friend of ours, Philippe Laurier, lies dead out on that field, murdered. A foul, most flaunting deed, the queen broke in, her voice strident with emotion. The king raised his hand imperiously. Let me acquaint Leonardo with the facts. Today we had a fine demonstration of marching formations done by special troops from the Netherlands, from Spain, and from Scotland. Is it not the Scottish warriors who wear the skirts? Leonardo asked curiously. Kilts, monsieur, corrected the minister Blanchard, cracking his knuckles. Kilts and tartans, said Francis. A brilliant uniform of red and green and yellow, which, I should imagine, would make these barbarians easy to shoot at. These and other colors are set in squares and stripes, monsieur, a distinctive pattern which differs from clan to clan, from terrain to terrain, said Blanchard. Blanchard knows more about it than I do, said the king tolerantly. He went to Scotland to make the arrangements for their coming. Monsieur Laurier is dead, chanted the queen. The king looked annoyed. What happened, he said, was that when the exhibition closed with the Scottish clan parading and playing their weird instruments, bagpipes, said the minister. Then the queen and I and the others here left the field and returned to the castle. We had just descended from the coach when word came that Philip had been killed upon the field, and we returned here at once. Tell him how he died, said the queen. A look passed between Francis and his wife, hers of acute suspicion, his of impenetrable aloofness. Come, Leonardo, and all of you, said the king deliberately, rising and leading the way toward the amphitheater. You must see how it was. Leonardo saw how Marigny, his former coach companion, walked close beside the queen, who paid no attention to him. She appeared to be sleepwalking. Then the king gave a quick sign to Marigny, and the latter came at once to his sire's side, like a hound trained to heel. Philip was a promising young nobleman from the south, the king continued as they walked. He went far in the last year since he came to court. It was his office at these outdoor affairs to represent the king's power at the close, after all the spectators had gone. He would approach the center of the field, blow a trumpet as a signal to the guards mounted along the hills, and remain in possession of the field until the soldiers had closed formation and retired. The king and Leonardo, followed by the others, passed through a pair of marble portals into a wide corridor cut from the hills, and entered a dell, the floor of which was covered with thick, springy turf. Elliptical in shape, with only the one entrance, the vale was perhaps 200 feet long and 50 at the widest point, close to the midsection. From the arena's level floor, the sides sloped gently upward, the reddish earth neatly landscaped with low-lying shrubs, cotoneasters, pyracanths, no one of them high enough to conceal a man. Creepers partially covered the ground, and flat, round stones were laid here and there so that one might mount to the hilltop without stepping upon the earth. How's everybody doing? We're deep into the 1500s with a murder mystery. At a glance, Leonardo could see that no one but himself and the royal party were within the amphitheater. They, and the figure lying motionless upon the greensward, close to the center of the field. At the sight of the inert body, the queen gave a cry of dismay. "It was your order, my dear, that he should remain here," the king said. "Let me speak now." "In a moment, my dear. Let us tarry here. Today, after almost everyone had left, Laurier approached the center of the field. The guards all had their backs to the arena, as is a fixed rule, so they did not see anything. The last 3 people to leave the arena were Count and Countess Angeville and their daughter. The king turned to a distinguished-looking middle-aged couple and a beautiful blonde girl. "Tell them what you saw, Angeville," the king said. "I turned first," Angeville said in a firm, resolute tone. "Philip had just started to raise the trumpet to his lips. We walked on for several seconds and were just about here, and then, when no sound came, I looked back, my wife and daughter looking back too. Philip seemed to stagger forward, away from us, dropping his trumpet. He turned slightly, and we caught the glint of the knife hilt as he fell. The knife could not have been thrown from the hilltop by any of the guardsmen." "They are too distant," the king said, "and the angle is too oblique for accuracy. The knife could only have been thrown by someone standing at the level of the arena floor." "But how could that be?" cried the girl with the blonde hair. Angeville took his daughter's hand in his. "It is impossible, and yet it happened," he said simply. "My wife and I and our daughter looked all about the arena from where we stood. There is no place of concealment. See there, even the tiers of marble benches are set flush in the hillside and offer no hiding place. I swear it, there was nobody within the arena but ourselves." "But you did not mind that Laurier was killed, did you, Angeville?" said the queen bitterly. Angeville paled, and the king raised his hand, but he could hold the queen in check no longer. "You knew your daughter was in love with Monsieur Laurier, and you were afraid they might marry," the queen went on. "Oh, the entire court knew about it." "Your Majesty," Angeville protested. "Oh, I don't say you did it, Angeville. You wouldn't have dared, but I cannot stand your hypocritical concern." She turned and faced Leonardo, her dark beauty wild with passion. "Monsieur Da Vinci—" "Careful now, my dear," Francis said resignedly. "Leonardo might take offense at your words and return to Italy, and we should be the poorer for it." The queen's lips curled in scorn. "Always Francis says to me, until I am weary, 'No other man has ever been born who knows as much as Leonardo da Vinci. Artist, inventor, engineer, mathematician, musician, philosopher, all these and more. He sees everything, he knows everything. Well, monsieur, I have not been willing to share my husband's views. I spent my girlhood in Valladolid, where Italian accomplishment is not held into high regard. I cannot help my feelings." Leonardo tilted his head in quick sympathy, tinged with satire. A friend of ours lies dead there." The queen closed her eyes. "So far as we can see, no one was at his side, nor anywhere around to kill him, yet he was stabbed. His Majesty and I shall remain outside the arena until the sun sets. That is in perhaps a little over an hour. We shall answer willingly any and all questions you may ask. If in that time the greatest mind in all Europe can discover who killed Monsieur Laurier, I shall be ready to agree with my husband's opinion of Da Vinci's skill." In the moment of intense silence that followed the queen's outburst, Leonardo was aware of the long shadows of the late afternoon, of a cloud of midges, and of the lazy flappings of the festive banners. A hysterical woman had flung down a challenge which the others were waiting to see if he would accept. He needn't accept, of course. He could go back to his peaceful garden and sketch golden orioles, but not for long. A frustrated queen would leave her husband no peace, and Leonardo felt a return to Florence now would be an anticlimax to his life. Sorry, I have to take a sip. Robin, Beth, welcome. Hope everybody's relaxed. "Very well, Your Highness," he said finally. "I prefer death to lassitude, and I never tire of serving others." He turned then, and with the minister Blanchard at his heels, walked toward the silent figure in the center of the field. Before his death, 3 years later, Leonardo da Vinci told Francis how and why he set out to work as he did that fateful afternoon. "When I was a boy in Vinci," the Italian master said, "my closest village playmates told me that the mark made upon the trunk of a tree grew higher from the ground with each year's growth of that tree. First, I made sure they believed what they said. If they were lying, it would be needless to investigate. When I soon found that even the adults of the village believed this true, I went into the woods, notched a healthy young tree with a fleur-de-lis, and measured it from the ground. I returned each year for 3 years and measured again and found that what everyone said was not true. A mark upon the trunk of a tree remains at the same height for the life of the tree, because a tree grows vertically from the ground, while its trunk increases only in its girth." First, then, that afternoon, Leonardo called Countess Angeville and her daughter to him. "Are you as certain as your husband, madam, that there was no one within the arena at the time Laurier was killed?" "Yes, monsieur," the woman said without hesitation, and her gray eyes were honest and steadfast. "And you, mademoiselle?" The girl nodded, though she seemed under a spell. "What did you do when you saw Laurier fall to the ground?" he asked the countess. "My husband ran forward to look at him, warning us to stay where we were. Then he ran back and told us to follow him, so that we might tell the others what had happened." "He forgot the soldiers who stood circling the tops of the hills?" "I suppose he did, monsieur." "Then all 3 of you ran out of the arena, leaving Laurier upon the ground?" "Yes." Leonardo turned to the girl. "Is it true, mademoiselle, as the queen suggests, that you and Monsieur Laurier wished to marry?" "No, no." She seemed to come suddenly alive. I loved him, yes, but he did not wish to marry me. I know this because there was someone else." Her mother laid a warning hand upon the girl's arm, and she fell silent. Leonardo did not press the question. He could guess who her rival was. "Would it be possible," Leonardo addressed both the mother and the girl, "that Laurier might have conceived this as a way of dramatically committing suicide?" "No, no," the countess assured him vehemently. "Philip was ambitious, alive to his very fingertips. The whole world was before him." Leonardo examined the sprawled body before he had it removed from the field, and withdrew the knife from Laurier's chest, where it had been embedded, to the dudgeon. It was a plain hunting knife, razor-sharp, and with a yellow bone handle. The Italian then had Minister Blanchard order the soldiers to bring a thick plank into the arena and set it upright in the exact spot Laurier had occupied. The soldiers obeyed with alacrity. "Now, who is proficient in the art of hurling the knife?" Leonardo asked Blanchard. "I am," the minister announced quietly. Leonardo was surprised. Such a skill appeared at odds with the man's self-effacement. And anyone else in the party? It is a common skill here in France, the minister said, shrugging. Baron de Marigny is my equal, and even the barbarian Bruce Stewart, the leader of the Scottish troops, has vied successfully with us. Ask those two to come here at once, Leonardo said. Marigny arrived with a gloomy countenance and stood sulkily by as they waited for Stewart, who at last marched vigorously into the arena, resplendent in his brilliant tartan. Ach, mon, the laddies tell me you want me to throw the knife. The knife. Sorry about that Scottish accent. Stewart said, smiling. He was a ruddy-faced Scot, with the heavy jaws and craggy brows, and he looked as if all of life was a laughing matter. I'd be muckle pleased to know my competitor. Leonardo stationed Marigny on the floor of the arena about 15 paces from the board, Blanchard halfway up the east side, cautioning him to stand only upon the flat stones amid the creepers. He placed Stewart at the top of the hill between two guards, whose discipline apparently was so stern that not one had turned to look at the proceedings below. And they had been standing there all afternoon. Leonardo used the bone-handled hunting knife in the test. Marigny threw first and embedded the knife so deeply in the board that it took 2 soldiers to pull it out. But first Leonardo studied the angle of the penetration. Blanchard threw second, and again Leonardo studied the angle. Stewart made 4 tries, missing the board altogether thrice, and succeeding only on his 4th try. "The sun was in my eyes," said the Scot, his face almost as red as his tartan. "But it was not only the sun," Leonardo told Francis. "It was the distance which made it unfeasible too, and I consoled him. You were right, your Highness. The murderer had stood on a level with his victim or slightly above, not as high as I placed Blanchard, for the blade had entered Lorius just at only a slight angle, and not acute as it would have been if the knife had been thrown from higher up." So now Leonardo knew that in spite of 3 witnesses who claimed the arena was empty, the murderer was there all the time. But where? He had a hint of the truth, but only a hint, and his time was now half used up. He had Blanchard order 6 soldiers to search carefully the west side of the arena for sign of footprints, for he knew the murderer would not handicap his aim by permitting the sun to shine in his eyes. In the meantime, while the soldiers searched, he detained Stewart and spoke with him. "When you left the field with your detachment, Monsieur Stewart," he said, "you returned at once to the castle?" "Aye, marching all the way and cutting tricks. The laddies were in fine form." "And was any man absent from your group?" "Not a one. All 16 of them acting as one man," he said proudly. Leonardo sat down upon one of the marble benches and sighed. Momentarily, he wished he were back in his garden making one of his numerous sketches of the golden oriole. Why should the oriole keep coming into his mind? Da Vinci listened a moment to the silence of his unconscious, for which he had a great reverence, and then said, "Tell me, Monsieur Stewart, have you enjoyed your sojourn in France?" "I have, aye, but many of the laddies are homesick and will be glad to leave. It's the country here, you know. Most of Scotland is very bleak and rocky, but there are parts of Appin, where we Stuarts roam, which are like this earth here, gentle and wooded and covered with brush. It reminds the laddies of home." "Footprints, footprints," one of the soldiers cried from a quarter way up the western side. Leonardo hastened up to him and saw 2 fresh imprints of a shoe beside a stepping stone, both of the right foot. Doubtless someone, the murderer, had missed his footing, perhaps in the excitement of a quick escape. The soldiers found no other print on the entire western slope. "At once," Leonardo cried to Blanchard, "get those guards down from the hill, those 5. He pointed to the men who guarded the major portion of the western side. "Monsieur Stewart, would you accompany him, please?" The Scotsman nodded willingly and set off climbing beside the king's minister. Halfway up, the minister sat down and rested, and instantly Leonardo took a small drawing pad and crayon from his cloak, and in a few deft lines portrayed Blanchard seated, clearly indicating his dejection and fatigue. "Why do you draw only Blanchard?" Baron de Marigny said querulously, looking over Leonardo's shoulder. "I draw what I see," the artist replied, putting his pad quickly away and swinging around to face the Baron. "Where were you when this tragedy occurred?"
"I was at the castle," said Marigny, scowling. "I was not feeling well, and I stayed the afternoon in my chamber." "And yet, when the Queen reached the castle on her return from the day's event, she sent you to fetch me, knowing you were ill?" "I was feeling better. I met them as they arrived, and when Her Majesty received the news of Laurier's death—" "And what was His Majesty's reaction?" "He didn't want her to send for you. I told you." Marigny's face grew suffused with anger. "But she was insistent." The 5 guardsmen from the hill watch arrived now and lined up for Leonardo's interrogation. Time was growing short. The sun had dipped behind the western hill, and the arena lay in blue shadow. One by one, Leonardo took a guardsman aside and said conspiratorially, "You and I know who slipped by you twice over the hill, don't we, monsieur?" Out of 5 poker faces, it was Leonardo's good fortune to find one which mirrored every thought process. The guard denied joint knowledge with Leonardo, of course, but at least the Italian now knew that if one was lying, so in all probability were the other 4. Leonardo was now sure of the solution to the mystery, so sure that he walked out of the arena, the minister Blanchard and Stuart trailing behind him. Marigny remained where he was. At His Majesty's pavilion, the Queen called out, "Your time is about up, Da Vinci." Many in the group eyed him with suspicion and hostility. Leonardo bowed and said, "One moment, Your Highness." He turned to Count Angeville, who stood surveying him calmly from beside the king. "Where were you seated during the performance?" he asked. Angeville looked taken aback. "Why, beside His Majesty, on his left." Francis nodded, frowning. "Angeville was on my left and Blanchard on my right." "And did His Majesty speak with you during the presentation?" Angeville appeared to think hard for a moment. "Only once, I believe." "And what did he say?" "Come, come, Leonardo," the king said testily. "Where is this leading us?" "Perhaps to the truth, Your Highness." "What did His Majesty say to you, Count Angeville?" "He said," Angeville colored and looked abashed at the women present, "His Majesty asked me if I thought the Scotsmen wore anything under their skirts." There was a ripple of laughter in the party, and some of the tenseness and hostility relaxed. Only the king glared fiercely at Leonardo. "Are you trying to make sport of me?" he demanded. "God forbid, Your Highness," Leonardo said humbly. Out of the corner of his eye he could see the Queen fidgeting, preparing to quell his questions. "And where, Your Highness," he said, addressing the Queen, "were you sitting?" "On a bench on the opposite side of the field, where the women always sit." And then, to the surprise of the entire party, Leonardo da Vinci sank down on one knee, bowed his head, and said, "I confess I do not deserve a higher evaluation in Her Majesty's eyes than I already possess. I have failed to discover how Monsieur Laurier was murdered by an invisible assassin. Moreover, were I given a year or 2 years, I do not believe I could solve this mystery. In extenuation, I will say that I am an old man, and perhaps my powers of observation have waned. I beg now to be excused." After a moment, the Queen nodded. Leonardo rose, and while the king and his party watched in frozen silence, he walked slowly, almost falteringly, to the coach that had brought him. But Leonardo da Vinci, in addition to his other accomplishments, was also a fine actor. Next morning he was sitting in his garden as usual, calmly and confidently making another sketch of the Golden Oriole, when Jacques announced the arrival of the king. Francis waved Leonardo back to his chair, then sat down on a bench beside him. "Leonardo," he said at once, "I wish to thank you for what you did for me yesterday. I shall not soon forget it. Now do not pretend further with me. You know who murdered Laurier, and how the miracle was accomplished." Leonardo said nothing, but watched the king steadily, as if he awaited further word. "There are times," the monarch said, lowering his eyes, "when it is politically expedient to remove a dangerous subject. Your own countryman, Machiavelli, has said this. Laurier was a traitor, bargaining in secrets with a foreign power." Leonardo nodded, knowing the real reason why Laurier had died. The Queen had made that plain for all to see. The king's subterfuge was pathetic. but Leonardo's acceptance of it made it possible for the two men to talk freely about the crime. "Tell me now what you know, Leonardo." "I know you had him killed, sire. When I realized the man whom you chose to commit the murder both entered and escaped from the arena with the complicity of the guardsmen, I knew they had their orders only from you. If the cause of the murder had been a simple, spontaneous grudge, and committed, say, by one of the Scottish soldiers or by Stuart himself, there could have been no such collusion." Francis nodded approvingly. "And you know the man whom I picked?" "The men," Leonardo corrected gravely. "One to commit the deed, the other to replace him by your side. When I learned that you asked Angeville a question about the Scottish dress, I knew the man on the other side of you was not Blanchard. Blanchard, who had been to Scotland, was familiar with all these details, and if he'd been at your other side, you'd have directed your question to him. Therefore, the man on the other side of you was someone who superficially resembled Blanchard, Baron de Marigny, who looks so much like Blanchard that I mistook him for the minister when he came to fetch me yesterday. It must have been a shock to him when I addressed him thus. He took pains to make himself up to resemble Blanchard even more, in order to deceive Her Majesty, who sat facing you on the other side of the field." "Ah, yes," the king said quickly. "Her Majesty liked Laurier. I did not wish to hurt her." "Of course, and now as to how it was done." "I thought my plan would amaze and perplex," cried the king. "And yet you perceived the truth. You must tell me your methods." Leonardo pointed toward the aviary. "By the help of the golden oriole there, who started a train of thought, I mentioned to Marigny yesterday how the oriole was hard to sketch in his natural habitat, which is among the green and yellow of the woods. His plumage blends into the background of sun-shot leaves in a protective coloration, making him virtually invisible. It is the same with the uniforms of soldiers, which are designed in many cases to help throw a cloak of invisibility about the soldier. It is common knowledge. The brilliant tartan of the Scottish warrior does this paradoxically. The terrain within the arena, with its red earth and green shrubbery, is much like the country of Appin, where the Stuarts live and fight. Stuart himself told me this, and when he climbed up the slope on the shadowed side of the arena with Blanchard, and they rested for a moment, I was moved to make a quick sketch of Blanchard, partly because Blanchard was all I saw. He appeared to be sitting alone, unless one focused one's eyes, especially to detect Stuart beside him. Curiously, was it not Blanchard who suggested to you this means of achieving invisibility?" The king nodded. "As I reconstructed it," Leonardo went on, "Laurier stood in the center of the field waiting for the last spectator to leave. He must have seen Blanchard come over the hill and wondered at it. Perhaps it delayed his putting the trumpet to his lips. Blanchard threw the knife at the defenseless soldier, and when the Angervilles turned and saw Laurier clutching his throat, Blanchard must have already crouched upon the side of the hill, with a borrowed tartan concealing him. The sun was still up, and his was the shadowed part of the hill, so he must have been virtually invisible. Then, when the Angervilles ran from the arena to fetch help, Blanchard completed his escape." Suddenly Francis seemed to lose interest. Thank you, Leonardo. You have explained it all with wondrous accuracy. And now I must go. I am needed at Amboise. I shall visit you again shortly." The king was hastening across the sunny garden when Leonardo stopped him with a final question. "And what about Monsieur Blanchard? He is to be rewarded for his pains?" The king whirled around, open-mouthed. "He is to be rewarded for his... Oh. Then, as a look of faint concern appeared, he shrugged. "Poor man, Blanchard," he said. "Her Majesty must have learned he did it too. They found him by the castle pond this morning, with a hunting knife in his chest. A pity, too, for it was a fine reward I promised him." And with that, the king disappeared behind a hedgerow, and Leonardo da Vinci, citizen of the world, contemporary of Machiavelli, sat peacefully down to sketching the elusive golden oriole, almost invisible in the sun-brilliant foliage. And so we conclude. I hope that was all right. Kind of Leonardo da Vinci cast as Sherlock Holmes.
Well, we went a little late tonight, but I enjoyed it. I hope you did too. Thanks, Sharon, Julie, Diana, for hanging. And this has been another episode, Carmen. Shelter in Place story time. We continue with our, what do we call it? Our citizenry, our active citizenry of sitting at home and not infecting each other. Don't vector each other. If you hear somebody saying, "You're vectoring me," you say, just back off. Just like, we don't need to vector each other, right? But we'll see what happens when we get to May. Ha ha ha! It could be crazy out there, but we'll just keep it going. We're a community, and we're all doing our part, trying to keep each other going, keep that creative energy going. I hope this was a relaxing evening if you spent it with me, and I'll continue again on Wednesday with Jazz Force Space Lounge. I'm working on an article about Space Force. If you'd like to read what I've got, let me know, and I'll send you an advance copy. And what else? Stay in touch, pksax.com, and Facebook, and blah-de-blah, YouTube, Venmo, at Paul Klemperer, yada, yada, yada. And we're doing okay, right? We're doing okay. So hang in there, and I'll see y'all soon.